At Monica's project launch gala, my sister lifted her glass toward the billionaire investor, smiled the way she smiles when she wants something, and introduced me as the disabled burden who lives off her charity. The fork stopped halfway to somebody's mouth. A whole table of strangers turned to look at me. I laughed. I had practiced laughing. Then the man beside her set his glass down on the linen. Slow and careful. And I watched Monica's smile freeze on her face. What none of them knew was that the man she'd just tried to impress had spent 3 years trying to find me. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we sit with the quiet women nobody counts. The sisters and daughters and mothers. Right up until the room finds out exactly who it was talking to. Drop a comment where you're watching from and be sure to subscribe if this resonates. My name is Irene and I am 30 years old. It is a strange thing to be told you are useless so many times that your own mind starts to agree. Years ago, an accident shattered the bones in my right leg and left me with a permanent, visible limp. The physical healing took months, but the psychological casting took years. Monica, my older sister, appointed herself the architect of my new reality. She moved me into the guest room of her sprawling house and carefully constructed a narrative that I was a broken thing. A charity case. A heavy, ugly burden that only a saint like her could bear. I allowed her to build that narrative. I let her parade me around as her personal good deed. When you are physically compromised and reliant on a meager disability check, your world shrinks. You learn to make yourself small. You learn the language of quiet gratitude. Even when the person feeding you is serving you poison. But I did not endure the daily humiliations for my own survival. I endured them for Albert. Albert is our youngest brother. He is 24 years old. Gentle, and utterly trapped in Monica's corporate machine. She hired him right out of college, promising to mentor him. But instead, she turned him into an indentured servant. He worked 80-hour weeks, fetching her coffee, formatting her slides, and taking the blame for her mistakes. Whenever he tried to leave, Monica would remind him of how much she was sacrificing to keep me housed and fed. She used my limp as a chain around his neck. If he quit, she threatened to throw me out on the street. So, I smiled. I nodded. I let her call me a useless invalid in front of her friends. I swallowed the bile and played the part of the tragic burden so my brother would not feel guilty. But Monica made one critical miscalculation. She assumed that because my leg was broken, my mind was broken. 2. She never paid attention to the frayed canvas tote bag I carried everywhere. She never noticed the heavy, outdated laptop hidden inside it. She thought I spent my days staring at the wall, waiting for her handouts. She did not know that while she was busy building a house of cards, I was quietly writing the future. I held my bag tighter. The transition did not begin with a grand argument. It began with the frantic, unsettling sound of claws scraping against polished hardwood. For weeks, Monica's house had been a whirlwind of aggressive preparation. She was gearing up for the biggest pitch of her career, a $50 million commercial real estate project that would cement her status as a top executive. The stress made her cruel, and her cruelty infected everything around her, including her expensive, purebred dog. I spent most of my time observing from the margins of the room. Because I move slowly, I see things other people rush past. I noticed the dog pacing in erratic circles. I watched it snap at empty air, its eyes darting wildly, the muscles in its back twitching with an unprovoked, nervous aggression. It was a clear neurological distress signal. One evening, as Monica was barking orders at Albert over a spreadsheet, the dog let out a low, guttural growl at a passing shadow. I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. I told her the animal was sick. I explained the behavioral patterns I had documented over the past 4 days and calmly suggested she take it to a veterinarian immediately before something terrible happened. Monica did not just ignore me. She weaponized the warning. She slammed her laptop shut and glared at me with absolute disgust. She told me I was projecting my own misery onto an innocent animal. She said it was pathetic how a broken, miserable person could only see sickness in the world. According to Monica, the dog was just stressed because I was constantly hovering around, radiating negative energy. She accused me of hating animals, of hating her success, and of trying to invent problems to ruin her perfect week. She told me to keep my twisted theories to myself and ordered me to stay away from her dog. She called me toxic. It is a very specific type of violence when someone takes your genuine concern and twists it to fit the ugly caricature they have drawn of you. It is called gaslighting. And Monica was a master of the art. She needed me to be the villain in every minor inconvenience so she could remain the flawless martyr. When you live in the shadow of a narcissist, you learn that reality is entirely subjective. Truth is not based on facts. It is based on whatever makes them look best in that exact second. Monica needed the dog to be a perfect accessory for her perfect life, just as she needed me to be the tragic flaw she heroically managed. Accepting my warning meant acknowledging a flaw in her domain. And worse, it meant admitting that the useless burden had noticed something she had missed. Her ego simply could not afford the admission. So, she chose ignorance. She chose the comfortable lie over the inconvenient truth. I watched her go back to screaming at Albert, her beautiful, erratic dog trembling at her feet. The warning was entirely ignored. The inevitable collapse happened just days before the gala, right in the center of Monica's immaculate living room. It was the moment the remaining fragments of our familial bond shattered completely. Albert had come over to drop off the final presentation binders. Monica was standing near the glass coffee table, trying on a newly tailored silk dress she planned to wear for the billionaire investor. I was sitting on the edge of the sofa, quietly sorting through a stack of mail. The air was tense, brittle with Monica's demanding energy. Then, the dog snapped. It happened with terrifying speed. There was no warning growl this time. The animal's eyes glazed over, overcome by the untreated neurological panic I had warned her about. It lunged forward, teeth bared, launching itself directly at Monica. What happened next plays in my mind like a slow-motion film, entirely devoid of sound. Monica did not try to calm the dog. She did not try to sidestep. In a moment of pure, unfiltered instinct, she looked at the heavy silk of her dress, looked at me sitting nearby, and made a choice. She reached out, grabbed me by the shoulder, and violently shoved me into the path of the frantic animal to shield herself. With my compromised leg, I had no balance. I crashed hard onto the polished floor. My knee struck the sharp edge of the table. The dog, confused and terrified, collided with me. I felt the tearing of my cheap jacket, the heavy impact of the frightened animal, and the deep, throbbing ache of fresh bruises blooming across my ribs. I managed to push the poor creature away, and it scrambled into a corner. Shaking, I lay on the floor, gasping for air, the pain radiating through my damaged leg. But the physical impact was nothing compared to what followed. I looked up, expecting to see horror or remorse on my sister's face. Instead, I saw Monica frantically inspecting the hem of her silk dress. She smoothed out a microscopic wrinkle, let out a massive sigh of relief, and then glared down at me. She told me I was incredibly clumsy. She snapped that I had almost ruined a $10,000 gown and ordered me to get up. She did not ask if I was hurt. She did not care that she had just used a human being, her own sister, as a human shield. In that singular, crystal clear moment, staring at her cold eyes, something fundamental shifted inside me. The guilt I carried for being a burden evaporated. The obligation I felt toward our shared bloodline turned to ash. I realized that my sister did not view me as a person. I was a prop. I was a buffer. I was entirely expendable. I pulled myself up from the floor without a word. I did not cry. I did not yell. The time for emotion had passed. I limped back to my room, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of peace. The mental chains she had wrapped around me for years simply dissolved. The illusion was finally dead. The bruises on my ribs and arms throbbed with a dull, persistent heat beneath the fabric of my cheap, long-sleeved blouse as I stepped into the sprawling, gold-accented hall of the Chicago Country Club. It was the night of the gala. The night Monica intended to secure a $50 million investment from the legendary magnate, Magnus. I had not wanted to come, but Monica had insisted, threatening to fire Albert if I did not play my part. She needed her tragic prop. She needed to present herself to the investors not just as a brilliant executive, but as a deeply compassionate woman who graciously supported her severely disabled sister. Albert walked a few paces behind her. His shoulders slumped under the weight of 3 heavy briefcases, his eyes avoiding mine. He looked utterly defeated. A prisoner to her ambition, I found a seat at the edge of the main table. Placing my frayed canvas tote bag carefully on my lap, I watched the room perform. I watched men in bespoke suits and women in diamonds orbit around power. And then, I watched Monica make her move. Magnus arrived. He was a quiet, imposing man who commanded attention without ever raising his voice. He had built his empire on precision and structural integrity, preferring cold data to warm charisma. Monica intercepted him almost immediately. A dazzling, perfectly calibrated smile plastered across her face. She guided him toward our table, pouring on the charm, eager to demonstrate her moral superiority. As they approached, she gestured toward me with an open, sickly theatrical hand. She introduced me to the billionaire, her voice carrying just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. She told him I lived with her because of a terrible accident years ago. She made sure to mention that I had not been able to work or contribute since, and that I relied entirely on state disability and her endless generosity. She finished by saying that family was family, and we all must carry our burdens. She wrapped the insult in a velvet ribbon of fake empathy. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the immediate area. People looked at their plates. Albert visibly flinched, his face burning with secondhand shame. If you have ever had to smile through someone else's cruelty just to survive, drop a comment below. Keep listening, because the tables are about to turn. A year ago, that introduction would have crushed me. A week ago, it would have brought tears to my eyes. But tonight, with the physical ache of being used as her literal shield still radiating through my bones, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical clarity. The power dynamic in the room was entirely an illusion. Monica believed she held all the cards because she wore the expensive silk dress. She believed that physical vulnerability equated to intellectual weakness. I did not shrink away. I did not lower my head. I looked straight into Monica's eyes and I smiled. It was a gentle, polite smile. I gripped the handles of my frayed bag, knowing exactly what was resting inside it. I let her have her moment of supreme arrogance, fully aware that she was standing on a trapdoor she had built herself. I was ready for this. Magnus did not offer me a look of pity. He did not ask Monica about my condition or validate the cruel narrative she had just spun across the white linen. Instead, the billionaire investor kept his eyes fixed on the open laptop resting near Albert's elbow. It was displaying the core architecture of the $50 million project Monica was pitching. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He ignored my sister completely and pointed a heavy, manicured finger at a specific string of code pulsing on the screen. He asked who had written the sequence handling the load distribution. Monica laughed. A nervous, breathy sound. She rushed to explain that her brilliant internal engineering team had developed it over 6 grueling months. She tried to close the laptop, eager to redirect his attention back to her rehearsed presentation. Magnus placed his hand firmly over hers, stopping the screen from shutting. He looked directly at me. He noted that the architecture contained a highly unusual, brilliant variable, a microscopic logic workaround that bypassed standard rendering delays. He said he had seen that exact same signature variable once before, in a white paper published anonymously on an obscure tech forum 3 years ago. He asked me, directly and respectfully, why that specific variable was there. I did not raise my voice. I did not glare at my sister. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a woman discussing the weather. I explained the mathematical constraint of the original framework. I told him how standard load distribution would fail under the sheer weight of a $50 million structural render. I explained the variable I had created to solve it. I told him I wrote it 5 years ago, typing with one hand while lying in a rehabilitation bed, trying to ignore the pain in my shattered leg. Monica's face went completely blank. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind an ashen, terrified mask. Magnus slowly stood up from his chair. He looked around the table of wealthy, silent executives. He announced, in a voice that carried absolute authority, that the woman Monica had just introduced as a useless burden was the sole architect of the entire project. He stated that his firm had spent 3 years searching for the brilliant mind behind that code. Monica tried to speak, but no sound came out. The woman who had built her entire life on projecting power suddenly looked remarkably small. She had brought me to this gala to be a prop in her play, a ragged contrast to her shining success. She had no idea she had just carried the author of her own destruction right to the center of the stage. The room went perfectly still, but a cornered animal is a dangerous thing. And Monica had spent a lifetime fighting dirty. The shock on her face quickly hardened into something desperate and vicious. She was not going to let a $50 million deal slip through her fingers without tearing the room apart. She did not apologize. She did not express a single ounce of remorse for the years of emotional abuse. Instead, she reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her eyes were cold. She dialed her lead corporate attorney and placed the phone on the center of the table. Switching it to speaker, she loudly explained the situation to the lawyer, making sure Magnus heard every word. She stated that I was an unemployed dependent. She emphasized that I lived under her roof, ate the food she purchased, and utilized the electricity and network infrastructure paid for by her company. The lawyer's voice crackled through the speaker, arrogant and rehearsed. He declared that under standard corporate resource policy, any intellectual property created by an individual utilizing company assets automatically defaulted to the ownership of that company. Monica smiled, the venom returning to her posture. She told Magnus that the architecture was legally hers. She demanded that the $50 million investment proceed as planned, and added that I had no legal right to the $500,000 licensing fee the code was worth. Albert shrank back in his chair, his eyes wide with fear. The surrounding executives murmured among themselves. The heavy machinery of corporate power was attempting to crush the marginalized woman one last time. It was a terrifying, suffocating display of legal bullying. Have you ever seen someone try to steal credit for your hard work? Tell me below. Let's see how Irene handles this trap. Monica crossed her arms, standing tall in her $10,000 silk dress. She looked down at my cheap blouse and my physical limitations, fully believing that her wealth and her lawyers made her invincible. She thought she had found the perfect loophole to erase my existence once again. I let her finish speaking. I did not panic. I did not interrupt the lawyer. Nor did I plead with Magnus to believe me. When you have spent years anticipating a war, you do not flinch when the first shot is fired. You simply return fire with overwhelming precision. I reached into my frayed canvas tote bag. My hands were perfectly steady. I bypassed the old laptop and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was sealed with the embossed stamp of the state government. I placed it on the white linen, right next to Monica's phone, and slid it toward Magnus. I kept my voice in that same, unwavering rhythm. I explained that I had never used her company's resources. I told the room that 5 years ago, using the back pay from my disability settlement, I had quietly established an independent limited liability company. I purchased my own refurbished computer under that company's name. I paid for an entirely separate, private cellular internet network. Magnus opened the envelope. Inside was the official certificate of intellectual property registration, fully secured and legally bound to my independent firm. The dates were undeniable. The ownership was absolute. I looked at Monica, whose arrogant posture was beginning to physically crumble. I told her that justice is rarely decided by the person who yells the loudest. In the real world, ownership is decided by the person holding the legal signature. And I had signed everything. The lawyer on the speakerphone went dead silent. A few seconds later, the distinct click of the call ending echoed across the table. Magnus closed the folder with a definitive snap. He picked up his coat. He looked at Monica with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. He informed her that his firm did not do business with entities that committed intellectual property fraud. Nor did they invest in people who abuse their own blood. He pulled his funding on the spot. $50 million vanished into the air, carried away by a few pieces of stamped paper. Monica reached out, grasping the edge of the table as if her legs could no longer support her. She looked at the expensive dress she had tried to save at my expense. It suddenly looked like a costume for a play that had just been canceled. Her empire collapsed on paper. A year is a remarkable measure of time. It can stretch forever when you are trapped in a room built on lies. Or it can fly by when you are finally building your own. I am sitting in a brightly lit office overlooking the city. The space belongs to my new algorithmic research institute. Magnus did not just become my first client, he became my primary strategic partner. We revolutionized the rendering architecture for 3 major commercial districts. The fallout from that night was absolute. Monica was terminated by her board of directors the following Monday. Without the massive investment, and facing the public exposure of her fraudulent claims, her career imploded. She was buried under a mountain of debt and lawsuits from angry shareholders. She lost the sprawling house. She even lost the dog, which was legally rehomed to a quiet, loving family after the state intervened regarding its untreated stress. We do not speak. I do not wish her harm, but I do not owe her my presence. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but protecting your peace is a mandatory practice. The greatest victory, however, was not Monica's defeat. It was Albert. The morning after the gala, he walked into Monica's office, placed his security badge on her desk, and walked out without saying a single word. He is now my lead project manager. He looks healthier. He smiles more. And he works a normal 40-hour week. He finally knows what it feels like to be valued for his mind, not exploited for his loyalty. I set aside a portion of my licensing revenue every month. I used it to establish a foundation that provides technology grants and coding scholarships to individuals recovering from severe physical trauma. I want them to know that their minds are the sharpest weapons they will ever wield. I look down at my leg. The scars are still there. The limp remains. But they are no longer symbols of a burden. They are the roadmap of my survival. Legacy isn't what you inherit from toxic bloodlines. It's the table you build for yourself when the room refuses to offer you a seat. If there is a quiet woman in your life carrying invisible scars, Remind her of her power today. Remind her that the world might measure her by her physical limits, but she can write a code that changes the entire system. Subscribe for more stories, and I'll see you in the next one. I finally took my seat.